Algerian government official, a fellow at the Algerian Institute for Strategic Studies before he moved to the United States in 1994. He's been accepted as a visiting scholar at the Harvard Center for Middle East Studies before he accepted a position at California State University, San Marcos, where he's taught courses on Islam and the politics of the Middle East and North African politics. He also taught American government at Mesa College, and he gave a series of 6 lectures on the Arab Spring at the University of California, San Diego in 2011 and 2012. In addition to his best-selling book, A War Memoir, he is the author of numerous articles and op-eds commenting on contemporary Algerian politics. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Emily, Collier, John Katz, and Robert Techno for your kind invitation. I would like to start with a bit of history. Algeria was invaded and occupied beginning in 1830. It took about 17 years for the French to complete their conquest. And almost immediately, it is 40 years later exactly, in 1870, they produced a notorious decree, Decree Crémieux, granting French citizenship to all Algerian Jews, only them, divide and conquer. Interestingly enough, in the 1830s, when the French proposed the so-called Bloom-Violette project, granting French citizenship to about 20,000 Algerians among the elites, Messali Hadj, the leader of the Nationalist Party at that time, refused it, saying that you have already taken away from us the Jewish elite. We don't want you to take the remainder of the Algerian elite. This is just our history. My presentation starts with my late dad. He was a humble, self-educated blacksmith who joined the first nationalist movement as an immigrant worker in Paris, the North African star, just as the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire, 2 movements emerged, the nationalist movement and the reformist Islamist movement, continuing to this day within the Algerian society in a coexistence which is unfortunately no longer peaceful. Then he joined the Algerian People's Party, the movement for the triumph of democratic liberties that succeeded the North African Star in 1937. And then the FLN, when the revolution started. The first chapter of my book starts with him, and I said in that chapter that André Malraux claimed that only death turns man's life into destiny. And I disputed that, because what really sealed my personal destiny was the sight of my father being tortured when I was 7 years old by French troops because they discovered in our house a war rifle prepared for some future insurrection. Without that sight, perhaps I wouldn't have lived as a child in a burning hatred for the French. Perhaps I wouldn't have joined the resistance and met in the process a legendary hero, Colonel Amirouche. By the way, there is no relation. Colonel Amirouche, without whom I would have never attended a high school and still less American universities. So I lived with the hero. The Colonel Amirouche is in the middle, and to his right is the fierce-looking guy talking to you. spent a year with him, and I described the search and destroy operation that were really organized against us and against particularly this national hero, who, when he was killed in 1959, the French government met to assess the impact of the elimination of Colonel Amirouche. So I spent a year describing 2 search and destroy operations among many, in which we were taken, one in 1957 and one in 1958. In 1958, we were introduced for the first time to bombardment by napalm, by B-26s, US-made B-26s. And in the second search and destroy operation, I described how we were encircled in a village, and we managed under a hail of fire to break the encirclement, found a shelter in a forest, and at night we headed back to the village, but there was no village anymore. It was in flames. It was set on fire by the French troops to punish the population, and everybody had been either arrested or fled, except one old woman pulling a goat on a leash. The flames lit up the figure of that old lady, and she had lost everything because of us. So it was our responsibility. We were not supposed to be caught in the village. And yet she turned to us and said, "God bless you, my children." So I was so deeply moved at that time, and still am. And I dedicated my book to her, and to her exclusively. I describe also some dirty tricks that we used against the French army, and which the French army used against us. We're going to get to that in one moment. After a year with Colonel Amirouche, I was ordered to go on a mission to Tunisia. But before we get to that, I'll describe quickly one operation that was organized by the French against us, the organization of a counter-guerrilla force of some 1,500 guerrillas, Algerian guerrillas, which turned out to be a devastating blowback against the French, because the 1,500, superbly armed and highly paid, joined us after they inflicted heavy casualties in the 2 ambushes against French paratroopers. The other trick used by the French against us is the so-called bleuite. I'll explain to you what happened. This is a letter that I drafted personally, signed by my chief, who was still a major. He was not a colonel yet. And the mentioned secret is by the French Secret Service. This was a letter that I found in a book published by Paul Alain Léger, specialized in psychological warfare, in disinformation, and so forth, which proves, the date is September 22nd, 1957, and the commander on the Algerian side, during the Battle of Algiers, Sadi, was arrested 2 days later, 2 days after this letter was sent to Algiers, which proves, beyond any doubt, I confirmed that with Alistair Hall's work, beyond any doubt that as soon as Sadi, the commander-in-chief during the Battle of Algiers, on the Algerian side, as soon as he was captured September 24, 1957, who took over? as the commander-in-chief, Captain Paul Amirouche, French officer. How did he do that? A few days before Yes Saadi was captured, he nominated his assistant military commander. But the military commander was captured by the French, and they kept totally secret the capture. Captain Paul Amirouche worked on him and convinced him to work for him. He ordered him to continue to communicate with Yes Saadi, the commander-in-chief, and when the commander-in-chief on the Algerian side was captured, who took over? The assistant named Safi, that means Captain Paul Amirouche. From that time on, he didn't need to forge documents. It's with authentic documents that he came to our military zone, captured 12 guerrilla fighters with no shot fired, and started the process of suspicion. We knew we were infiltrated, and the end result was some 400 guerrilla fighters suspected of treason, interrogated and executed. Just as this plot was foiled, Colonel Amirouche called me and said, "You have been appointed to be a part of a commando in charge of taking a huge sum of money and secret document to the provisional government stationed in Tunisia." This is the document that enabled me with 3 others to go to Tunisia, and which says Hamou, and we used only first names. Hamou is a special envoy to the provisional government of Algeria. This is the mission. You see me here carrying a knapsack containing a huge sum of money along with documents, reports, and so forth. It took us 42 days walking from this part across the Atlas Mountains into the Ores Mountains until about here, to cross into Tunisia through the desert. Why the desert? Why did it take us 42 days? To avoid, we thought, the electrified fences with hundreds of thousands of landmines along the borders which sealed the border. It was virtually impossible to cross. And we thought it would be easier by going through the desert where the fences did not reach. Unfortunately, it wasn't that easy because we fell in an ambush. And among the 35 guerrilla, actually we're not guerrilla, midway 30 civilians joined our commando to go fetch arms from Tunisia. So in the wee hours in the morning, April 27, 1958, machine guns, submachine guns, individual rifles, tracer bullets, and so forth, decimated our ranks. When we counted our ranks, we were left about 12 out of 35, and we were really lost in the desert because our guide was among the missing. So it was really a barking dog that guided us toward the tent, and we explained our plight to the nomad, and he said, "Well, what can I do for you? It's going to be daylight in 1 hour or so, and you have a hill with 2 or 3 bushes, or my tent." So we said, "Your tent." And of course, we could see the banana-shaped helicopters landing troops on that hill with 2 or 3 bushes. And we waited until about midday, and then at midday, just as we were served some bread and dates, the man posted outside rushed into the tents and declared first that we were dead, and then second, that the French troops were coming. We tried to melt into some gray rocks in there. And I will never know what exactly happened because the French troops really came by, maybe, I don't know, 20 feet or something like that. Eyes fixed on our tracks on the desert. And they didn't see us, or they did. And being draftees, they know if they see us and declare that we're there, they would be the first one to receive either the grenade or the... it happened before. We experienced that in our military zone. The draftees don't want any trouble. They don't want to start a firefight. So we delivered that knapsack in Tunis after crossing between armored vehicles patrolling the border with powerful searchlights. We managed it, and if we had been 35, we'd have never been able to cross. 24 hours later, we delivered the knapsack to one of the Algeria's founding fathers, Karim El Qasem, and a message came from Colonel Amirouche announcing that he was coming to Tunisia to settle accounts with the provisional government, doing nothing to sabotage the electrified fences. And and he was coming, and he was killed on the way to Tunis, probably betrayed. In the same message, he ordered me to return to school. And here I was at the age of 20-something in 8th or 9th grade, quite embarrassed with the kids that were in the same class. And I studied so hard, and it was possible when you come out of the war, you have the motivation and the willpower, particularly when my chief was killed. So I studied so hard that I earned my French baccalaureate in 3 years instead of 6. And the man in charge of within the provisional government to monitor the students were convinced I was a genius. They didn't know I was using drugs to keep awake. And where else would they send me? To the United States of America to continue my studies. First at Georgetown University, where I lived with great sadness the independence of Algeria, because it started with civil war. That army in Algeria, in the sanctuary, the Tunisian sanctuary, now marched into Algeria to seize power after slaughtering in the process a few hundred Mujaheed. And there started a pattern of Algerian politics continuing to this day. Authoritarianism resting on 2 pillars: populism and a highly efficient secret police. The populism crumbled with the collapse of the oil prices in 1986, and the other pillar is continuing to this day, in the sense that Boumediene, who took over, introduced the practice of holding power by force, and it's challenged by force. The reason for that is that whenever the formal power of the president, knowing that he doesn't have any legitimacy being appointed by the army, whenever he attempts to secure some kind of legitimacy, he is either overthrown or assassinated. That's the pattern continuing since independence in Algeria. So far as I am concerned, I finished my studies in 1967 and worked for the Algerian government, and eventually was prominent enough to be sent to New Delhi, India, where I represented Algeria at the United Nations conference in 1982. You see me there with a beard. That doesn't mean I turned into an Islamist. With Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi, who unfortunately a great lady. I mean, she made a speech incredible. Unfortunately, she was assassinated 3 years later. That's more or less my story. I could add that regarding today's Algerian politics, it's more of the same. Bouteflika has been off and on in power since 1962. It's the same. The government really doesn't need the consent of the governed to stay forever. All it needs is the indifference of the people. The people are fairly well fed. Algeria has even a problem of illegal immigrants from the south because bread is relatively free in Algeria. People are well fed, they are decently housed, Algeria is flush of money, and therefore the populist policy still continues to a certain extent. This is how peace is maintained. To conclude really with an idea regarding how regimes or dynasties are maintained, I would like to quote Albert Hourani, who is the author, who was the author of the masterpiece, History of the Arab People, who adapted an idea from Ibn Khaldun, I'm sure you all heard, some of you anyway, by Asabiya in Ibn Khaldun's works. You need only three things for a regime or a dynasty to maintain itself forever. Just three. And they apply to the modern world. First, monolithic regime, monolithic leadership at the top. The monolithic leadership at the top has to align itself with the most important, most powerful segment of the society. At the time of Ibn Khaldun, it was the most powerful tribe. Today in the United States, the most powerful tribe is the middle class. The alliance of this cohesive leadership at the top with the most powerful tribe within the society must be expressed in an idea that we would call today an ideology that legitimizes the power, the rule of that cohesive leadership in the eyes of the society, or at least the most important part of the society. Anyway, this is what I have to say. Thank you for your attention.
Now we have some time for discussion.
J'ai pris trop de temps?
Non, trop peu.
Oh. That's what I was saying. You want me to talk more?
Bouteflika really is still from that generation of the revolution and the FLN. Is there a younger generation of politicians that could replace this dynasty?
Yes, the problem in Algeria is CIA. CIA, not like the CIA. Cooptation, assassination, intimidation. So the elite, the so-called secular elite, and some actually Islamist elites have been co-opted by the government. This is what enables the regime to continue to this day. This is what enabled the army to cancel the first democratic elections in the region in January 1992. Without the support of those secular elites, actually combined with Islamist elites of the modern type, without that support, I don't think the army would have dared to cancel democratic election in January 1992. We leave alone for the moment also the fact that the United States turned the other way when that happened. Yes?
This is a rare occasion for me. Thank you for your presentation. A rare occasion for me to ask you about your experience in Tunisia. I happen to come from Tunisia. If you could share with us a little bit more about your time spent in Tunisia. Is there one name or a couple of names of Tunisians with whom you interacted at the government level or otherwise? And then you pointed to the desert area. I wanted to find out from you where specifically you crossed. Is it Hazwa, like toward Nafta and Dozer? Or?
Very good question. Well, I said in my book that I came almost directly from the bushes of northern Algeria to Georgetown University, where I had some problem getting really adjusted culturally, but my culture never clashed with American culture. So I mentioned the fact that when we were served for the first time in Georgetown University in the boarding house, a bowl of cornflakes and a glass of milk, we didn't make the connection. So we munched on the cornflakes and drank the milk afterwards. It took us some time to get adjusted to everything, but it went on very smoothly. But within Tunisia, I never went out. I never went for 3 years. I was studying and nothing else. So I had very little connection with the Tunisian people, even though I render vibrant homage to the Tunisian people, without whose support I think the war in Algeria would have lasted 2 more years. The support of the Tunisian people for our revolution has never wavered. That's what I want to say.
After you moved here to America,
Oh, sorry. Just excuse me. Yeah, I forgot to tell you where we crossed. Yeah, we crossed exactly at Fariana.
Fariana, okay. Near Kasserine.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Fariana. And excuse me one second. And the surprise is that imagine if the Tunisian police or custom people had stopped us, what would have happened to that huge sum of money that we carried? To this day, I say, thank God nobody stopped us, and even though we were in uniforms, dirty, bearded, we hadn't taken a shower in more than 40 days. So, but we were happy. We were happy to be there, and the Tunisians were so warm to us. They invited us to lunch or dinner or whatever we wanted, really, because they knew the kind of danger that we had just escaped from. Sorry.
Not a problem. Could you tell us a little bit about 2 things? My questions are, being here in America, did representatives of the American government interview you while you were at Georgetown? And then secondly, what did you think of, say, a figure like your fellow countryman Albert Camus, who was not able to really decide one way or the other on the Algerian war?
Well, interview us in Washington,
Right.
Georgetown.
Right.
Well, we were obviously watched
Yeah.
very closely because particularly myself being an ex-guerrilla fighter and Algerian leaning left, we were very closely watched. We were interviewed immediately after the ceasefire by the Washington Post, and our picture, we were 4 students, our picture appeared in the Washington Post. But apart from that, we knew we were watched, but nobody ever really showed it to us. They had this, if they were of the Secret Service or CIA or FBI or whatever, they had what needs to work in that field, according to Mr. Churchill, a passion for anonymity. The other side of the question is Sorry?
Albert Camus.
Albert Camus. Albert Camus, we revolutionaries never really appreciate him as a person. We never really forgave him for his declaration. I prefer my mother to justice. Mother for us at that time, meaning Mother France. So we never forgave him for that. This said, I'm really a fan of his literature. I read and reread several times The Stranger, L'étranger. I think it's a masterpiece. Apart from that, he was French. He was one of the first to call the government, the French government's attention to the misery, to the poverty of the region where I come from, Berber Mountains, Kabylia. But apart from that, he was French to the end. Yes.
You mentioned the involvement of CIA Langley. What is the evidence that is obvious?
Well, I think you misheard me.
I may have.
I said I mentioned the CIA and not Langley CIA.
Oh, okay.
I said CIA is co-optation, assassination, and intimidation, which is really what's used in Algeria and some other underdeveloped countries to maintain power. Because the sheer authoritarianism, a dictatorship by itself cannot be maintained forever. You have to get some support from various groups within the society.
The procedures of CIA or the actual CIA is involved?
No, the actual CIA is probably involved in the sense that it always favored particular political group within a particular society. But that's not known. But the only thing we know, which is documented, is this co-optation, assassination, intimidation. This we know. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the divide and conquer policy that separated Jewish Algerians from the rest of Algeria. How were Berber Arab relations in the resistance? Did you operate as segregated units or?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, the third military zone where I served included several Arabic-speaking areas, because in Algeria there are no Berbers and Arabs. There are Berber-speaking Algerians and Arabic-speaking Algerians. The overwhelming majority of the Algerian people are Berber. I was just mentioning earlier statistics, which is documented by a French historian. When Spain was invaded in 710, there were exactly 12,000 warriors crossing what is known as Gibraltar, which is a deformation, as you know, of Jebel Tariq. Tariq being the Berber general who crossed into Spain with 12,000 warriors, among them only 30 Arabs. So Algeria is Berber, just like the rest of the North African countries. During the war, there was really the revolution more or less cemented Algerian unity. But there are problems. There are problems, as you may know. In 1980, the Berbers revolted because they were denied their culture, their language, and so forth. And the revolt continues to this day, even though the Berbers, of which I am, maybe equally, have managed to secure the recognition of our language, our mother tongue, as a national language. The struggle still continues for the Berber language to be recognized as an official language along with Arabic. So the fight continues to this day. Historically, what's really important to retain is that the Berber revolt in 1980 was the first to emerge outside the FLN party, National Liberation Party, which was officially the ruling party, even though everybody knows that it was really the army that ruled.
Can you add a word or two about the Berberist crisis in 1949?
Yes, yes. In 1949, it was the movement for the triumph of democratic liberties, which succeeded the Algerian People's Party in 1947, that really represented the nationalist aspirations. At one point, there was a group within that party, political party, nationalist political party, saying, well, enough of this slogan, the Arabo-Islamic dimension of the Algerian society. Stop saying that. There is another dimension which precedes the Arabo-Islamic dimension. It's the Berber dimension. And they were more or less excluded from the party, and one actually has been assassinated, even though they were not claiming that Algeria was Berber. They were just demanding that the Berber dimension be added, and therefore adding a new wealth, if you wish, to the Algerian, to the components of the Algerian society. Berber, Arabo, Islamic. Personally, when in my writings, in my lectures, and in Algeria in particular, I always say, stop saying Arabo-Islamic or Berber or Arabo-Islamic, say Algeria is Algeria, period. Just one more remark, which is important. During the war, which lasted, as you know, between 1954 and 1962, de Gaulle proposed to us autonomy, divide and conquer as usual, and the Berbers refused it. So no, we are fighting for the liberation of Algeria, not the liberation of Berber country. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. It's really been splendid. I do a lot of research on asymmetrical warfare, insurrectionist, guerrilla warfare, and so forth. And you mentioned that the French clearly engaged in various kinds of abuses, torture, interrogation, and so forth that we consider now sort of violations of laws of war, Hague and Geneva Conventions, and so forth. And I'm wondering, on the Algerian side, whether there was some kind of code of engagement, code of war that the Algerian revolutionaries tried to adhere to, or did in fact adhere to.
Yes, I mentioned in my book and in some of my talks that when my father was being tortured by the French in 1945, at that time I was too young, 7 years old, to understand why they locked us up in a room with a large window to watch our father being tortured. I couldn't understand. It's later that I understood that it was done intentionally so that my father would hear our loud cries to awaken his resistance to pain. And I mentioned that during the Algerian Revolution, the French would cross a new threshold in ignominy by forcing a militant under interrogation to watch the rape of his wife, mother, or sister. This happened, documented. And in retaliation, this is really typical of asymmetric warfare. In retaliation, I mentioned in my book what the Mujaheed had done against French soldiers, which is equally abject. And I can't mention it here. It's really too shocking. So the laws of war have never been respected, not even during classical war like World War II. As you know, everybody knows that the Geneva Convention have been really stepped on, and they have never been more so in asymmetric warfare, more so when the French never recognized us as legitimate fighters who were rebels or sometimes outlaws, terrorists, whatever. I give you a quick example. In 1958, we captured a camp with 18 French prisoners, with no shot fired, essentially because one of the soldiers, a sergeant, was an Algerian within the camp. So we tried to exchange the lieutenant with another lieutenant, Algerian lieutenant, captured by the French. I remember him when he left the command post, and he was captured 2 days later by Paul Algerian, the one who infiltrated our military zone. We tried to exchange the two records. The French never recognized that. So they executed our lieutenant, and really in retaliation, we executed their lieutenant. And the French daily Libération at that time wrote a very courageous article saying, well, this retaliation, this process, this endless revenge, counter-revenge, or whatever, should end, must end. Otherwise, we cannot save lives. But of course, they never really recognized that. Even today, there is a reluctance to recognize the Algerian war as a war. It was recognized only 3 or 4 years ago by the French government. Yeah, it was a war and not the maintenance or the attempt to maintain or restore order, as they called it. Yes.
I have a question about sort of about torture. How do I frame this? I remember about 10 years ago or so, the memoirs of I think Ossares were published. The general who tortured, I think.
Ossares?
Yes. And in Algeria, I believe, and it was a scandal, and people were saying, well, we should try him for war crimes now, and that's really not my question, but it kind of sets up my question. It's about the level of discourse that you and others have when you get together. Number one, do you ever get together with people who were participants in, in either the War of Independence or any other sort of combat on the French side from that era, and what's the level of discourse at those meetings? And I'm just reminded of when Americans and North Vietnamese get together and discuss things that happened during the Vietnam War. It's a very, sometimes very tense, but at the same time there's a sense of trying to understand things historically. And I'm wondering if you participate in those often, and how is it?
Yes, I described tortures that I watched, torture of my father, but I should mention that years later my father would tell me that those beatings which I watched as a kid were like caresses, even though he would faint at regular intervals with a bucket of water reviving him. He said those were like caresses compared with waterboarding that he was subjected to in 1954. Waterboarding using toilet water, the bottle, or the electrical shocks. This gun is really powerful of asymmetric warfare. During the war, a French writer said that now that we have a proof that we are abusing the Algerian prisoners, using the same techniques as the techniques used by the Gestapo against French resistance, I think we should be quiet about denouncing the abuses of the Nazis during the occupation of France. Similarly, I must admit that in the struggle against the Islamist terrorists, the Algerian secret service, secret police, are using exactly the same techniques of torture as the French used against us, used against Islamist militants or terrorist capture. Now, regarding the bilateral dialogue, about a year and a half ago, I met with other veterans of the Algerian War, with French veterans having about our age, and I proposed something which hasn't occurred yet, essentially because we are not recognized really as legitimate fighters during the war, trying to establish a joint commission, like it happened in Vietnam, to look for the missing in actions. To this day, almost every now and then, after the publication of my book, I receive letters, messages of sons or grandsons looking for their father, disappeared. The reason why I proposed this commission, which I hope will be created, is that when I was finishing my book, I was describing a meeting which I had with the French prisoner, and I wasn't sure about his name, his actual first name, and I wanted to Google and discovered that his brother is looking for him to this day. That's more than 50 years ago. So I wrote to him, and he answered. And at the beginning, I told him that I met his brother, that I guarantee, and this was true. He has never been mistreated in any way, and that I really don't know what happened to him. He didn't believe me. He said, you don't want to tell me that he was executed. I said, well, if it had been the case, I would have written to you. The only thing I know is that he was being taken to Tunisia to be exchanged. In Tunisia, it was possible. In the interior, it was not possible. And told his brother in my message that I know from experience that it was extremely difficult to remain alive when you go from northern Algeria to southern Tunisia. And that's why out of 35, only 12 of us survived the ambush. I hope this commission will see the day one day.
Could you extend your comment on Algeria today and whether it must have some of the same conditions that Tunisia had before Ben Ali was driven out? I mean, you would have said in December 2010, nothing will ever happen, and then, 6 weeks later, he was gone. So there was growing unemployment, scarcity of resources, and in Algeria, matter of water seemed to me scarce when I was there 20 years ago. Corruption that begins to just eat away. Do you see the Arab Spring and the changes in Egypt and Tunisia, and even some things in Morocco having an impact in Algeria?
Well, Algeria is really a country of superlatives. It's the only country in history that was colonized for so long and managed to recover its independence. The only country in the region that fought almost 8 years of war to liberate itself. And the first country in the region to organize democratic elections in 1991. Quite a few people forget about that everything really started in terms of establishing democratic institutions. Everything started in Algeria first. And we know what happened. Algeria, the army didn't like the results of the first round and they canceled the elections, triggering more than 10 years of a very, very bloody civil war. I called it in my book and in my talks the new Algerian war, with the new Battle of Algiers occurring in the Casbah. So people right now, even though they see next door revolutions occurring, people don't want to go into another bloody civil war. That's one thing. The second thing is that Algeria is flush with money. It's one of the very few countries in the world that has, along with China, that has so much money and no debt. So whenever there is a riot, and usually it's always for social reasons, social economic reason, the Algerian government pours money into that particular sector. Same thing happened in Saudi Arabia. Same thing. They are flush with money, and therefore they buy social peace. The police, Algerian police, has had a 40% increase in salary recently during the so-called Arab Spring. The Islamists themselves, who originally were structured by veterans of the war in Afghanistan against the Soviets, coinciding with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, those have either been killed or melted into the society within following a law, Concord, National Concord, the pardoning terrorists provided they don't have any blood in their hand, and of course every terrorist had blood, but they were pardoned anyway. So quite a few of them have integrated society. And there is a new phenomenon which is sort of quite overlooked quite a lot. It's the fact that in beginning, what created really is the Islamist movement, which was marginal, a fringe movement in the 60s and 70s, and mutating into a mass movement at the age of the 90s. It's essentially hasty market economics, marginalizing hundreds of thousands of Algerian citizens. The pensions melting, just like in Russia, by the way. And they were the vacuum left by created by the state, by the government, was filled by the Islamists. And then the Islamists led with the army to a very bloody civil war. So individuals now are fed up with that. And they are learning as individuals to fend for themselves. They are managing, surviving, and when a country is flush of money, there is always something trickling down to the rest of the population. Yes?
From what I understand on the radio, listen to the radio, is that the last elections in Algeria had extremely low turnout.
Absolutely.
So how is that interpreted? Is that a protest against the existing Bouteflika government, or is it, the guy they interviewed on the BBC said, this is our Arab Spring, where people seem concerned. They didn't vote. So is it a protest or is it apathy?
Yes, in Algeria, nobody believes in elections anymore since 1991, when the first democratic elections occurred. You're quite right, there are probably 25% recognized by some circles of the government participating in elections. They don't care because they know their particular status is not going to drastically change if you bring somebody else into power. So what's happening in the election of course, is that it's decided by really the army. At the top, the so-called DRS, which was created to replace the military security, establishes quotas. This party will get so many seats in parliament, this one, in accordance with their influence or their support for Bouteflika or some other general. This is how it's happened. So there are no elections, and everybody knows it. Even the government recognizes it in private. Yes, sir.
Do you think Algeria has started or will soon intervene in northern Mali?
Yes, it's a very messy situation with Islamists being apparently very active, but Islamists doing the bidding of some powers, interestingly. What complicates the situation is really what happened in Libya, with some 10,000 missiles that just vanished, and some of them are probably ending in Mali. Algeria has been calling for a peaceful solution negotiated in the framework of the African Union. But I understand that the United Nations more or less authorized an intervention by the French and the Americans in the region. Algeria has 7 borders, doesn't have the means to control them all. Sahara Desert is huge, as you know. So the relations of the Algerian army, the Algerian regime with the United States are extremely close. So there is a very close cooperation, which I personally like, because when I was a student here in the United States, I remember when Ben Bella came to this country, how he met with Kennedy, how he impressed the Cuban president, how he denounced the United States being responsible for tensions in the Caribbean, and so forth and so on. So I really welcome this change. So as long as the United States is there, it has more than $4 billion investment in oil and gas, so it has a stake. And as long as, then I am not worried too much about the French coming back through the back door.
I think we have time for one more question.
I have a question regarding the relation of the Islamists and the radical Islamists. I'm from former East Germany, and when the civil rights movement and the revolutions happened in now former communist countries, a lot of that energy came from the church. Yeah, in East Germany, mostly the Protestant church, in Poland, the Catholic church. And I have been wondering for a time whether that is, because religion was not controllable by the dictatorship. And so the opposition gathers in religious circumstances in these countries. And I'm wondering if this is to a certain degree what has happened in the Arab Spring as well, or to which degree these are really radicals that come from the outside.
Radicals are made, not born, you know that. Terrorist is made, not born a terrorist, so you have to look really at the factors that turn an ordinary human being like you and me into a terrorist or into a suicide bomber. This said, just like we saw in Poland, where the church was instrumental in bringing down communist rule in the 1980s, similarly, everywhere in the Muslim world, because of the factors that I mentioned earlier, the vacuum created by the withdrawal of the state, of the government in this social and economic sphere, everywhere in the Muslim world, if you organize election today, the Islamists will win them. If the Algerian scenario happens, if, for example, the army cancels the elections, then it triggers violence. Because nowadays, whether we admit it or not, there are only 2 ways to access and maintain power: force or universal suffrage. If you exclude universal suffrage, you legitimize the use of force. When the force starts, you cannot say it has to obey Geneva Convention or the Hague Convention or whatever. It's a total war.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Amirouche for sharing his